Ciao friends and welcome to a new SQL BI video. In this video, I want to talk about one of the latest implementations in Power BI, that is field parameters. Field parameters is a very powerful feature that lets you dynamically choose the columns to use in your matrix or in your visual to slice and dice data. It is a much needed feature that was possible before with a lot of effort, both from the DAX point of view and from the modeling point of view. Now it became a feature, a native feature in Power BI, and that is going to simplify so much the life of many Power BI developers. I'm going to show you what the feature is, then we'll learn how to take advantage of it, how to create field parameters in your report and in your model. And then, as we always do at SQL BI, we go a bit deeper, trying to understand the details of the implementation. Because as any new feature, it comes with limitations that you need to be aware of in order to take advantage of it the right way. Now, with no further ado, let's jump straight to the demo and let's start learning what field parameters are. I have here our usual Contoso model, and I have a matrix that is slicing by brand and showing the sales amount. But you notice that I also have a slicer here, and through the slicer I have the option of choosing to slice by brand or by category, and suddenly my matrix is now slicing by category or by color or by country. Continent and country are columns from the customer table, whereas a brand, category and color are from the product table. And I can not only choose one column, I can also decide to slice by brand and category later, so that I show first the brand and then the different categories of each individual brand. And the order matters. If I choose first category and then brand, you see that now I'm slicing by category first and by brand later. If I do not have any selection, then all the columns which are included in the slicer are used to slice and dice. So this is an extremely powerful feature because it gives users the option to customize their matrix and their visual, choosing the columns used to slice and dice. Creating them is quite simple. So the next step is, now that we have an idea of what a field parameter is to create it from scratch. I'm going to delete everything from the model, everything about the field parameters, and we create it together. So we learn what Power BI does in order to create field parameters. Let's do that. First, I need to get rid of the slice by table. Let me delete it from the model. Of course, this is gonna break the visual. Let me get rid of this and get rid of this. Now I only have sales amount and the slicer is not showing anything. And you see that in the fields panel, I do no longer have the slice by table. To create a field parameter, I need to go to modeling, new parameter, and I have the option of creating a field parameter. Clicking on it shows a dialog. I need to choose a name. It was slice by, so let's use the same. And then I choose the fields that I want to add in the slicer. So I can select the brand, the category, the color. That's from the product table, and from the customer table we can choose the country, the continent, and let me see, the state, or no state. Yes, the state. So we have brand, category, country, continent, and state. I'm missing the color. I wanted the color too, just to be consistent with what we had before. Let's add the color. And you can also choose the order. So I want the color to be right after category, or maybe just before brand. I also have the option of adding a slicer to the page. I'm not going to do that because I already have the slicer, but if you check it, at the end of the process of creating the field parameter, you will also have a new slicer that automatically filters it. When I click on create, I now have here my slice by table that contains a column slice by. I can use the slice by column in the slicer, and now I have the option of choosing brand, category, country, continent, and state. And I also use the slice by in the matrix, not in the values, I want it on the rows. And I have the behavior we have seen before. I can click on brand and then on color, on category, or choose the standard behavior. So you see that the creation of a field parameter is extremely simple. You just need to follow the steps of the dialog, and that creates the field parameter. Once the field parameter has been created, you can no longer edit it through the user interface. So if you want to change it, you need to edit the content of the table that has been created. Indeed, a field parameter is nothing but a calculated table. If you click on it, you can see the code that has been generated by the wizard. Slice by is a table that contains a first column, that is brand, the first element in my slicer. Then there is this new function, name of product brand. Name of is a new DAX function that just returns the name of an object. So you pass to it a column, and it returns as a string the name of the column. Why is it useful to use name of here? Well, the purpose is to make sure that the table will work even though you change the name of one of the columns. If I rename brand to something different, then the engine will change all the references to columns to that column matching the new name. Name of will then return the correct name. So you can change freely names of columns without breaking the field parameters. And that's the purpose of name of here. And the last column is the sort order. We can also take a look at the content of the table here. You see that we have slice brand and the name of the column and the slice by order. It's nothing but a calculated table. So a table that is created and it is then used to slice by. Because it's a table, you can also play with that. So nothing prevents you from adding columns to the table or changing its shape as long as the relevant columns and the relevant metadata stays there where it is. For example, I have columns that are coming from the product and columns that are coming from the customer. What if I want to create a hierarchy at two levels, where the first is the table and the second level are the columns that I can use? I can change the content of my slice by table, adding another column. Let's call brand is from the product table. So brand is from product, color is from product, category is from product, country is from the customer table. So I add a new value customer, same for continent, and finally for state. If I now hit enter, I have a problem. Why that? Because I have a parenthesis here that is not matched correctly. Okay, I now have my slice by table, and I also have value 4, which is the column containing product or customer. I can rename that and call it, for example, category. Then go back here, and in my slicer, I can add the category just before slice by. Now, in my slicer, I want to do that. In the slicer, I place it here, and I have my slicer at two levels from which I can choose the continent, the brand, or the entire customer columns, so that I have Australia, and then all the different states. That is powerful. It gives you the option of creating user interfaces for your users that are extremely simple to use and very dynamic. As I said during the introduction, you could achieve a similar behavior before, but that required creating complex tables and a lot of complex DAX code in order to understand what the matrix was slicing by. Right now, this is a feature in Power BI that just works. I guess you are curious, at least as me, to understand how it is working. So what is changing in the model, and how does Power BI know which columns to use to do the slicing by? We have the performance analyzer, so we can start understanding a bit better by grabbing the different queries that are executed by Power BI Desktop when field parameters are there. So we have just, let's slice by just one column, continent, to make it simpler. We launch the performance analyzer. Here it is. Start recording and refresh the entire visual. We have the slicer, and I do not expect anything fancy from the slicer. It just contains two columns. But then in the matrix, you see that we have the DAX query, the evaluated parameters. This is a new event that is tracked, the visual display, and then other. Let me copy the query and see what is happening under the cover. We need to launch DAX Studio to look at the content of the query. And then I paste the code here with a bit larger font, and let me gain some more space because the query is not short. We have a first DAX query that is slicing by category, where category is in customer. Well, this is just the slicer, and we have here actually the real query that is being executed. Summarize column with roll up at the subtotal by customer continent. If we look at the matrix, it is slicing by continent. So the query that is actually retrieving the values is slicing by continent. So it's not dynamic by itself. And then we have another query later that is computing. It has the filter from the slicer, the first part, and then it is summarizing the table containing the field parameter by slice by field, slice by order, and slice by. Let's first look at the content of this first query. Let me run it. The first query retrieves a customer continent, the order, and the slice by. So we place the filter on continent, and the second query retrieved customer continent, that is the column we want to use to do the slicing by. This basically means that this is probably the first query being executed, even though Performance Analyzer shows it as the second one. The first query is just a query that decides which column to use. And the second query, apart from this slicer that we can get rid of because it's basically useless, is just running this summarize column. We can also remove all this, place evaluate here, and this is the second query that is being executed, that contains exactly the content of our matrix. This is kind of relevant because it means that field parameters are not affecting performance. There will be a first query that gathers the columns that we want to use to slice by, and the second query would be the very same as if we added the columns to a regular matrix. That is good news. You can use field parameters. You will pay a small price whenever the engine needs to gather the column names, but then the real query, the one that might be heavy and complex, is not going to be affected by the presence of field parameters. So from the performance point of view, adding field parameters is not an issue. Nonetheless, there is an interesting topic to discuss here. This is the first time that I see Power BI running multiple queries where the first query changes the structure of the second query, and the second query is the one that actually retrieves the data. Which means that the way field parameters are implemented is not in the model, it's in Power BI. Power BI decides by inspecting some metadata that we are still about to discover in the field parameter table, which column it needs to use in order to run the query. So it's a feature that depends on the interaction between the client tool, Power BI in this case, and the data model. It's not a query that is sent to the model and the model knows about field parameters. This might be a limitation because if you are not using Power BI, maybe you are using Excel to run a query against a field parameter, it might not work. And the easiest way to discover that is to try it out and see whether field parameters are supported or not in Excel. So going back to our model, let me analyze it in Excel. So I open Excel on the same model where I do have my field parameter. Let's add the margin, the sales amount, increase the font a bit. Now, if I slice by customer, everything is working fine. But if I slice by, let's add the slice by to the rows, and we get an error that says column slice by is part of a composite key, but not all columns of the composite key are included in the expression. That basically means Excel still does not support field parameters. The query, the MDX query that Excel generates, does not take into account the fact that if I query a field parameter, I actually want to understand before the columns to use and then change the query accordingly. I don't know whether Microsoft is going to lift this limitation. That means changing the way Excel works against a Power BI file in order to support field parameters or not. Right now, the feature is just arrived, so we can expect problems and we have no idea whether this can be fixed or not, because that requires interaction between the data model and the client tool, and changing Excel and MDX is not an easy task. But it's a limitation you need to be aware of. Field parameters are a client tool feature. They work in Power BI, they might not work in Excel, for sure right now they don't work, and they might not work in other different tools. Let's go a bit deeper in discovering how field parameters are implemented, because so far we use them from a user point of view. We just created them. We learn how the query is executed. I also want to understand how they are stored in the model, because they are not part of the TOM architecture, so I do not expect them to have specific properties, but for sure Power BI needs to save something, maybe in extended properties or in some other places. So we can use Tabular Editor to discover the content of the model and see how they are implemented from inside. Let's do that. Let me go back here, and this time we launch Tabular Editor to inspect the content of the model. Okay, let me place it in the right place. I have all my tables, and among the many tables I have the slice by table that contains the code that has been generated. Category slice by, we have the slice by table and 4 columns: category, slice by fields, and slice by order. Slice by order has been created in order to change the sort order. Slice by fields contains the column, the name of, so the name of the entity that we want to set, and slice by is the column that is seen by the user. If we inspect the properties, the 2 columns which are relevant are slice by and slice by fields. Now, slice by fields has an extended property, you can see it here, that contains in parameter metadata version 3 kind 2. You can change that if you want to break the model, and we have no clear picture of what version 3 and kind 2 mean. What we know is that this is needed in order for Power BI to discover that slice by is actually a field parameter, and the slice by field is the column that contains the name of the column that it will need to use to perform the slicing by. Slice by, that is the column used by the user, does not have extended properties, but it has a group by column. You can see it here. If we expand group by column, you see that slice by is grouped by slice by field. That means whenever a query queries the slice by column, it also needs to add the slice by field column in order to gather also the name. If you set the metadata the right way, that means if you set that version and kind property in the extended metadata of the slice by column, and you make it group by the slice by field, then you obtain the very same effect. Of course, using the editor is much simpler. You can use Power BI Desktop, and through the user interface you can create field parameters quite in a simple way. As you have seen, field parameters are powerful. They are extremely simple to use, and they let you create in a very simple way dynamic reports where the user has the option of choosing which column to use to slice and dice, which column or which columns. Having the option of editing the table that is created by Power BI is also powerful. By the way, you always need to use the editor if you want to change anything later, because the wizard lets you create a field parameter, but it does not let you modify it. Nonetheless, it's just a small piece of DAX code that you can change very easily by adding values or changing anything. And you also have the option of changing the structure of the table to create hierarchies or to create more complex solutions. I'm honestly curious to see what users will do with these capabilities and what kind of reports will be created using field parameters. Enjoy DAX!